Here is something that puzzled me for months. How can the same rubber receive completely opposite reviews from different players? One person calls it fast and spinny, another calls it slow and unresponsive. Same rubber, same model, same hardness number on the box, and yet two players might as well be describing completely different pieces of equipment. And this is exactly what made me lose faith in the review system. I just couldn't trust anyone I didn't know. I thought it was perhaps due to different blades or different technique, and those are important factors. But there is something more, something that has to do with the rubber itself that makes it feel genuinely different in the hands of different players. Each rubber has a specific response profile, and within that profile there is what I call an activation window, a window of speed at which it performs best. And once you understand this, the way you think about rubbers will change for good. That's exactly what this video is about. I learned it the hard way. When I tried to buy my first serious rubber, I fell into complete chaos within minutes as I started looking online for info and a better understanding. I was instead inundated with unfathomable keywords and mysterious metric numbers: tensor, hybrid, tacky, classic, speed and spin on a scale from 1 to 10 for one manufacturer and 5 to 14 for another, sponges of different hardness, different thickness, and on top of it, I swear, if I searched long enough, I could find someone who loved and someone who hated every rubber ever made. So I gave up trying to understand it, asked the coach at my club, and walked out with a fast Arc G1 and a Ragza 7. Great rubbers, but I still had no idea why they were right for me. That frustration eventually led me to build Pongenius, an equipment comparison tool that takes a completely different approach to making sense of table tennis gear. And as I went deep on rubber specs from over 14 manufacturers, the same thing happened when I researched blades. Beneath all the chaos, there are actually a small number of fundamental ideas that, once you see them, make the whole thing surprisingly understandable. This video is about a framework, a simple way of thinking about rubbers that explains why they behave differently, why players disagree about them so vigorously, and why the same rubber can be perfect for one player and completely wrong for another. A transparency note. The graphs you'll see in this video are conceptual models based on compression research and personal experience, not empirical measurements. Most players never think about rubber specs this way, and once you do, you'll find it genuinely changes how you shop for equipment. So let's get into it. A table tennis rubber is made of two main layers: the top sheet and the sponge. The top sheet is the thin outer layer that actually makes contact with the ball, and its basic job is to provide a gripping surface that the ball can interact with. The sponge sits underneath and acts as the elastic engine of the rubber. It can be thin, less than 1 mm, up to more than 2 mm, as long as its combined thickness with the top sheet is no more than 4 mm. Let's have a quick look at these two layers in detail. The top sheet. Grip is simple. Top sheets fall into two broad categories. Friction grip comes from the texture of the rubber surface itself, like the surface of a car tire. The ball grabs the surface through physical contact and texture. Tacky grip is different. The top sheet is literally sticky to the touch. It physically adheres to the ball on contact, and in some rubbers the tack is so strong it can hold the ball on the rubber upside down. Both approaches are designed to grab the ball and help generate spin, but they do it in fundamentally different ways. Tacky grip requires no compression of the sponge. The ball simply sticks to the surface, allowing spin to be generated. Friction grip relies more heavily on the sponge to do its work. The two components need to act together to generate speed and spin effectively. These differences have significant implications for how each top sheet type responds to technique and speed. We'll come back to that when we look at the four rubber families. The sponge is where things get genuinely complicated, and where the table tennis industry has done a particularly poor job of communicating what actually matters. Two properties define almost everything about how a sponge behaves. Let's look at them carefully because everything that follows depends on understanding both. Hardness. Rubbers usually come with a hardness value indicating the resistance of the sponge to compression. It's expressed in degrees. The higher the number, the harder the sponge. For most table tennis rubber, this suits somewhere between 28 and 55 degrees. Hardness is exactly what you might expect, how difficult the sponge is to compress. A soft sponge deforms easily under the ball. A hard sponge resists compression and requires more force to engage. But what is the point of having sponges of different hardness in the first place? To put it simply, it is born out of the necessity to cater to the different power levels achieved by different players. Players who do not hit hard want ease of play, forgiveness, and control, which a soft sponge will provide, while professional players require rubbers that remain responsive at high speed and power levels, where soft sponges would simply bottom out, and that are stable and flexible even under extreme pressure generated by powerful shots. And yet, sponges with the same hardness rating are not all made equal. They can behave in surprisingly different ways due to the differences in their inherent elasticity. Elasticity is arguably more important than hardness in defining a rubber's personality, and yet it is not usually presented to players with a single comprehensible metric. It can be described as how efficiently the sponge returns the energy you put into it. A highly elastic sponge behaves like a loaded spring. You compress it and it snaps back, returning energy into the ball. A less elastic sponge behaves more like a pillow. It absorbs energy rather than reflecting it, dramatically reducing the ball's exit speed. Imagine bouncing on a loose trampoline versus a tight one. The elastic trampoline will bend under your weight and spring back, pushing you upward with increased speed, while the loose one will just give under your weight with no energy return. Different manufacturers constantly experiment with sponge design and composition and frequently come out with new patented formulas highlighted in their marketing materials with the most exotic names: Energy Cell, Ultramax, Optimized Energy Sponge, Direct Energy Transmission Tech, Hyper Bounce, Gigacell, Momentum Sponge, just to name a few. The manufacturers are communicating something important here, although I believe not very successfully, that not all sponges have the same elasticity and that elasticity is extremely important. This becomes even more evident as the rubber hits the ball with greater power. Think smashing the ball or hitting a powerful topspin. Low elasticity sponges lose more and more energy as harder you hit, while high elasticity sponges maintain their performance across a much wider range of velocities. We have seen how hardness and elasticity play a critical role in the rubber performance, but now, here is the part that most players and most reviews completely miss. Hardness and elasticity are almost entirely independent of each other. A hard sponge can be highly elastic, snapping back powerfully once compressed, or it can be inelastic, dense, absorbing energy rather than returning it. A soft sponge can feel lively and explosive, compressing easily and snapping back fast, or it can feel dampened and dead, compressing easily but returning very little energy. This is perhaps one of the most misunderstood distinctions in table tennis. Players talk about rubber hardness as if it explains everything about its performance, but hardness only tells you how difficult it is to compress the sponge. It tells you almost nothing about what happens after compression, and what happens after compression is the entire game. Now we have everything we need. It's time for the central insight. Here it is. Table tennis rubbers don't behave the same way at all impact speeds. Different speeds, the same rubber, very different feel and performance. Let me show you exactly what I mean. This is the idea that changed everything for me. As I looked at rubbers from many manufacturers and compared them for the Pong Genius project, it became clear that each rubber had a specific performance curve. In other words, how it behaves in the speed range it can be exposed to, from 1 meter per second taps to 40 meter per second smashes. It also became clear that within that profile, there exists for each rubber what I call an activation window, a range of impact speeds where that rubber performs at its best. It's the range where energy loss is minimal and the rubber returns energy efficiently rather than dissipating it. At low ball speed, the sponge is more difficult to compress. Its activation is weak and energy return is low. As speed increases, the sponge starts to give in to the pressure and becomes more active. It stores and releases the ball energy effectively, pushing it out with force. This is the sweet spot, the activation window. As speed increases, the sponge is compressed further to a point where it becomes increasingly harder to further compress, and its elastic response bottoms out. At that point, the sponge has nowhere left to go. The contact feels harsh, the response becomes unstable, and any additional force produces diminishing returns on the exit speed of the ball. What I've just described is the performance curve of a generic rubber and its activation window, the true character of a rubber, if you will. And, as you can imagine, they depend directly on the interplay of the sponge hardness and elasticity with the top sheet properties of each rubber. Let's look at two extreme examples. Soft, elastic sponge, friction grip. The activation window is shifted towards the left. Early activation translates into a prompt and lively response. However, the rubber reaches its bottoming out threshold quickly. Hard and weakly elastic sponge, tacky top sheet. The activation window is shifted towards the right, where the sponge starts to compress effectively. Great for powerful topspin, but it requires much higher impact forces and can feel unresponsive or difficult to control at low speed due to both the hard, difficult to activate sponge and the tacky top sheet configuration. If you think about it, this explains perfectly why two players might react very differently to the same rubber. A professional player generating great racket speed may activate a hard sponge perfectly most of the time, while an intermediate player using the same rubber never compresses it enough to reach its optimal range. Both players are experiencing the same rubber, just at different points in its performance curve. One is constantly hitting in the activation window, the other not. So the first player will say the rubber is excellent, while the second might find it unresponsive or frustratingly inconsistent. Manufacturers are generally aware of this, but have largely chosen not to communicate it directly, perhaps for fear of overcomplicating an already complex subject, except for Andro, which, in its most recent catalog, acknowledges this directly. Instead of assigning a single speed value to their rubbers, they publish a speed range. When I first saw this, I found it confusing. Now, having understood the activation window, it makes perfect sense. A single speed rating can only tell you the maximum potential of a rubber. It tells you almost nothing about how that rubber behaves at lower impact speeds. A speed range, on the other hand, is much closer to reality. It is in effect the activation window. And this single reframing explains a great amount of the confusion surrounding table tennis rubbers. So now you understand the activation window. The next question is what determines where that window sits. Why does one rubber activate at low speeds while another demands full power before it wakes up? We will explore this in depth as we look at the 4 rubber families in the next episode, but before we finish, it's time to circle back, as promised, to friction and tacky grip. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the concept of the performance curve and activation window, it's going to be much easier to fully understand them. I have teased that friction grip isn't just about the top sheet. It depends on how much of the top sheet actually touches the ball. We've seen that if the top sheet just touches the ball, virtually no grip is generated. A friction grip needs the top sheet to curve around the ball, creating a contact patch. Wrap around it more, and that contact patch gets bigger. More contact, more grip, more spin potential. Now, here's where sponge hardness comes in. At low force, slow strokes, short game, serves, a softer sponge lets the ball sink in more. The rubber deforms, wraps around the ball, and you get that larger contact surface. A harder sponge resists that deformation. The ball sits more on the surface, less contact, less grip, less spin potential. But as your swing speed increases and the impact force goes up, even harder sponges start to compress and wrap around the ball. That contact patch grows, the gap between hard and soft starts to close. So, spin generation for a friction grip-based rubber is not just a function of the natural grip of the top sheet material, but it also depends on how much of the top sheet is touching the ball at any given time. This has some really practical consequences, particularly for hard sponge rubbers. Serves, for example, is one of the most clear. On a serve, you might want high spin and low speed. That's exactly where harder sponges struggle. There isn't enough impact force to compress the sponge and build up contact area to easily generate high spin while keeping the ball speed slow. You're basically fighting the rubber, and a higher technique level is required to achieve spin levels that are much easier to produce on softer rubbers. This is actually why many high-level players use a high toss serve. The ball arrives with momentum already, enough to compress the top sheet on contact, even on a soft brushing stroke. They're using physics to get around the limitation, so they can vary the depth of the ball while generating great spin. And this is why beginners often struggle to generate spin with hard rubbers. It's not technique, or at least not just technique. The rubber is literally working against them at the speeds and forces they are producing. Tacky rubbers flip the equation. With friction grip, you need force to build contact. Tacky grip gives you adhesion from the first moment of touch. No compression required, so you can generate spin even at a very low speed. Very light contact. The trade-off is that on flat shots, especially slow ones, that same stickiness that helps spin can action as a brake to the ball, stealing pace that you don't necessarily want to lose. We have reached the end of this first 2-episode series on rubbers. I had to cut it into 2 as it was getting really too long for a single video. In the next and final episode, we look in detail at the 4 rubber families, several real-life examples on how the framework applies to real rubbers, and finally, but most importantly, I will provide an intuitive way of estimating the profile curve and activation window of almost any rubber you come across, just based on the manufacturer provided parameters and metrics. So, stay tuned, and I hope to see you healthy and happy in the next one.